It was a crisp autumn evening in the suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the neat row of houses. In one of those houses, Sarah was getting comfortable, wrapping herself in a soft blanket on the couch, ready to binge-watch her favorite TV shows. The quiet of the house was a relief after a long, stressful week at work. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting her peaceful moment. A quick glance revealed a message from her mom checking in. Sarah smiled and texted back, then resumed her show. Everything seemed normal, until there was a sudden knock at the door. Startled, Sarah froze for a moment. It was late, nearly 9 p.m. Who could be visiting at this hour? She checked the peephole and saw Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. Her eyes seemed wide, nervous, and a little too frantic for someone who was always so calm. "Sarah, dear, I need to talk to you." Mrs. Whitaker's voice trembled through the door. But curious, Sarah opened the door. Mrs. Whitaker looked at her with a sharp, unsettling gaze. "I know you're new here, but you need to listen to me. Stay out of your backyard after dark," Mrs. Whitaker said in a hushed voice, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid someone might be listening. Sarah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Is something going on?" The older woman's face tightened, her hands shaking. "If you hear whistling, don't go outside. Trust me, just don't go." Sarah stood there, puzzled. "Whistling? Mrs. Whitaker, I'm sure it's just the wind or someone's music." Mrs. Whitaker shook her head. "It's not the wind, it's a lure. Please stay inside after dark. You've been warned." Before Sarah could respond, the elderly neighbor shuffled off quickly, leaving her standing at the door, feeling more confused than ever. As the evening wore on, Sarah tried to shake off Mrs. Whitaker's strange warning. It didn't make sense. Whistling? That was absurd. The old woman was probably just hearing things. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine, pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, and sank into the couch. But then, around 11:30 p.m., she heard it. Faint at first, just barely noticeable soft whistling. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. It seemed to float through the air, carried by the wind. Sarah sat up, glancing at the window. Was it just her imagination? She looked outside, but the yard was empty, dark and still. Shook her head, trying to laugh it off. It was just the wind, or maybe a bird. Nothing more. But then it came again, clearer this time, a series of soft notes, barely audible, coming from the backyard. Her heart began to race. Sarah stood up and walked over to the back door. She hesitated, staring into the darkness. Something in the pit of her stomach told her that maybe she should take Mrs. Whitaker's warning seriously. But she told herself it was nothing. Stepping outside cautiously, Sarah scanned the yard. There was no one there, nothing out of place, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She sighed in relief. But as she turned to go back inside, she caught something strange. Her garden gate, which she always made sure to lock, was slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened. The next day, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the whistling. It had been so strange, so unsettling. She had been home alone and heard nothing else. But that sound, it lingered in her mind. She decided to check her backyard that morning, hoping it was just some late-night prank or the wind playing tricks. As she stepped into the yard, she noticed the muddy footprints near the back door, just like the ones she had seen the previous night. Her heart skipped a beat. Had someone been in her yard? Sarah frowned and checked the security cameras, but they hadn't captured anything out of the ordinary. The footage showed nothing, as if the cameras had skipped over whatever happened. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe even a raccoon, getting into the trash. That night, Sarah decided she wasn't going to let her imagination run wild. She locked all the doors and windows and settled in for another quiet evening. But as the clock neared midnight, she heard it again. The whistling. It was louder now, more insistent. This time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She walked to the window, peering outside into the darkness. A shadow moved quickly across the yard, vanishing into the tree line. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't the wind. Someone was out there. The second night brought more tension. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whistling continued, and now it seemed to come closer each time. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there was drawing her in. She checked the security footage again. The screen flickered, glitching just as the whistling started. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. Was someone tampering with the cameras, or was there something else? Suddenly, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Mrs. Whitaker's name. Sarah quickly answered. Sarah, the old woman's voice was shaking. You have to stop going outside. The whistling, it's not a sound, it's a signal. They use it to lure you out, to make sure the house is empty, so they can break in. Sarah's blood ran cold. You have to listen to me. The man who does this, he's been breaking into houses all around here, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He waits until you hear the whistling, and then he comes. He's already been to your house. He knows you're alone. That night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She Googled her address, searching for any criminal activity in the area. The search results made her stomach drop. There had been a string of burglaries in the neighborhood over the last few weeks. The details were chilling. The burglars weren't stealing valuables, they were leaving behind cryptic symbols and messages, but always making sure the house was unoccupied when they struck. The whistling wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning, a lure. Sarah's hands shook as she closed her laptop, realizing the danger was much closer than she had imagined. She stood at her window, looking out into the backyard. The whistling started again, right outside her door, chilling her to the bone. Suddenly, there was a sound behind her. Footsteps. The back door handle jiggled. "Hello, Sarah," whispered, voice trembling. She moved closer to the phone, ready to dial 911. The steps outside continued, slow and deliberate. With shaking hands, Sarah grabbed her phone. "Hello," she whispered again, hoping the person would go away. She called 911, her voice barely above a whisper. Seconds later, she heard a loud bang on the door. The footsteps paused. The whistling stopped. It was as if time had stopped. And then, with a thud, the back door swung open, but no one was there. The police arrived moments later, just as a man was spotted sneaking around the back. They apprehended him before he could do any harm. It turned out that he had been using the whistling to draw people out of their homes while he robbed them. In the days that followed, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the whistling. The house felt empty now, despite the safety measures. She called Mrs. Whitaker to thank her, but the old woman never answered. Sarah realized she was no longer alone. She was always watching her backyard. And sometimes she thought she heard that soft whistling on the wind. The haunting sound forever tied to the danger that nearly claimed her. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway of apartment 4 billion, keys still warm in her palm from the landlord's hand. The rent was suspiciously affordable for downtown, but after 3 months of searching, she'd learned not to question small miracles. Besides, the building had character, that's what she told herself as she eyed the peeling wallpaper and caught the faint scent of mothballs. The bedroom was what sold her. Spacious, with large windows and an ornate floor-length mirror that seemed to belong in a Victorian mansion rather than a modest apartment building. Its bronze frame crawled with intricate vines and flowers, so detailed they almost seemed to move in her peripheral vision. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the landlord had said during the showing. "Original fixture. Previous owner was quite adamant about it, staying with the property." He'd chuckled then, a dry sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. The first few nights were uneventful. Sarah settled into her new home, arranging furniture and hanging photos, always catching glimpses of herself in that grand mirror. Sometimes when she was alone, she'd practice her presentations for work in front of it, appreciating how the afternoon light made everything look softer, dreamier. But then came that first strange night. She awoke at exactly 3 a.m., the kind of awakening that feels like being yanked from deep water. The room was cold, impossibly cold for a summer night with no air conditioning. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed the mirror's surface, clouded with an inexplicable fog despite the bone-dry air. As she watched, heart thundering against her ribs, something began to move across the fogged surface. Not random condensation patterns, but deliberate strokes. Letters forming words helped me. The message hung there for 3 terrible seconds before fading, leaving Sarah to question her sanity in the pre-dawn darkness. She might have convinced herself it was a dream, if it hadn't happened again. And again. Each night, like clockwork, the mirror would fog up at 3 a.m. Sometimes there were messages. Sometimes just the sound of movement behind the walls, too rhythmic to be pipes, too deliberate to be rats. Her research started innocently enough. Late-night Google searches about mirror phenomena and unexplained condensation, but then she dug deeper. The building's history revealed a pattern of disappearances stretching back decades. All tenants of 4 billion, all young women living alone. The previous owner, one Theodore Thaddeus, had been questioned multiple times but never charged. He'd vanished 5 years ago, leaving behind a maze of legal documents and a son who'd inherited the building but was never seen on the property. Mrs. Patterson from 4C finally told her the truth over tea one afternoon, her wrinkled hands trembling as she spoke. Thaddeus was obsessed with watching over his tenants, said he was protecting them, but girls kept disappearing. The police found cameras once hidden everywhere, but they never found she'd trailed off, eyes distant. That night, Sarah examined the mirror more closely. Her flashlight beam caught something a hairline gap between frame and wall. When she pressed, the entire mirror swung outward like a door, revealing a dark passage that shouldn't exist. The beam of her flashlight illuminated fresh food wrappers, modern surveillance equipment. Worst of all, photos of herself sleeping pinned to a cork board like butterfly specimens. You weren't supposed to find this. The voice behind her belonged to a man who could only be James Thaddeus Jr., his face a younger echo of the newspaper photos she'd found of his father. "I've been watching you," he said, blocking her exit. Like father watched them all, keeping you safe, protected. Although he tilted his head, studying her with the detached interest of an entomologist, sometimes protection requires permanent solutions. What followed was a nightmare of narrow corridors behind walls, her flashlight beam bouncing off dozens of two-way mirrors. James pursued her through his labyrinth, calling out about inheritance and responsibility. She found a room filled with monitors showing every apartment, years of logged footage, and a wall of photos missing tenants forever frozen in time. It was her phone that saved her. One desperate call to her friend Mike, who arrived with the police just as James had her cornered in his observation room. The flash from her phone's camera had disoriented him long enough for her to fight back. They found evidence linking both Thaddeus men to a dozen disappearances. The building's walls were honeycombed with passages, each apartment compromised by at least one two-way mirror. Sarah supervised the renovation herself, watching as each mirror was removed, each passage sealed. But sometimes, late at night in her new apartment across town, she catches movement in reflective surfaces, windows, TV screens, the chrome of her coffee maker. And for a split second, she swears she sees something watching from the other side, patient and hungry, waiting for her guard to drop. After all, she knows better than anyone some things never stop watching, even after the mirrors are gone. It was a quiet evening. Jake sat on his couch, watching the flickering glow of the TV screen, a mug of tea resting on the coffee table in front of him. The evening was his time to unwind after a busy workday. He had no plans to go anywhere, no obligations to meet, just the comfort of his home. The soft chime of the doorbell broke the silence. He wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitant, Jake got up and made his way to the door. Through the peephole, he saw no familiar faces, just a cardboard box, resting innocently on his doorstep. Odd. There was no return address, no name, nothing that could identify the sender. Just a plain, unmarked package. With a raised eyebrow, Jake opened the door and squatted down to pick it up. The box was medium-sized, heavy for its dimensions. His curiosity piqued. Jake held the box in his hands, unsure of what to make of it. Had it been delivered by mistake? Did a neighbor order it by mistake? He knocked on the neighbor's door, but no one answered. Shaking his head, he decided to inspect the package more closely inside. But as he entered his house, Jake paused. Was there a mistake? He could have sworn he heard someone walking down the hallway outside. No, it was probably just the house creaking in the wind. He placed the box down on the hallway table and sat back down. The silence returned. The doorbell rang again, louder this time. Jake's curiosity shifted to wariness. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. He opened the door again. This time there was a delivery driver standing on the stoop, a clipboard in hand. "Hi, sorry about this, but I think there's been a mix-up," the driver said. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in a nondescript delivery uniform. "I'm with a local service. I believe that package is meant for another address in the neighborhood." Jake frowned. "I didn't order anything." "What's the address on the package?" The driver glanced at his clipboard. "I'm not sure. I don't have the details with me, but it was mistakenly dropped here. I'll need to take it back." Jake wasn't sure what to think. The delivery man seemed insistent, but also strangely evasive. Something didn't feel right. "No, I'm not handing it over until I know what's going on," Jake said, closing the door slightly. The driver's face hardened, his smile disappearing for just a moment. All right, but I'll be back later. You can't keep it forever. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Jake to wonder just how much of a mix-up this really was. Jake spent the next few hours replaying the interaction over and over in his head. Why had the driver been so insistent? Why didn't he have any real information about the package? Jake, still unsettled, tried to dismiss his suspicions as paranoia. But as he sat back down to relax, the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't a polite knock. It was an urgent, insistent pounding on the door. Jake's heart raced. He walked cautiously to the door and peeked through the peephole. There, standing on the other side, was the same delivery driver from before. His expression had shifted from calm to something more desperate, maybe even frustrated. "Look, I really need that package back," the driver said through the door, his voice tight. "There's been a mistake, and it's really important that you return it. Now." Jake hesitated, glancing at the box that was still sitting innocently on the hallway table. Was this really a mistake? The driver had been far too eager to take it back, and now his insistence was beginning to feel more like an attempt to manipulate him. "No, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not giving it to you," Jake responded, voice steady but uneasy. "I'm not going to ask again." The driver's voice grew colder. "Open the door now, or there will be consequences." Jake stepped back from the door, his pulse quickening. What could the consequences be? He tried to call the customer service number on the driver's uniform, but the number he dialed rang through to an automated message that seemed disconnected from the company it claimed to represent. Jake's unease grew into something darker, a deep sense that something was terribly wrong. The driver stood on the doorstep for a moment, glancing over his shoulder, then turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Jake shut the door quickly, locking it. But as the evening stretched into night, Jake kept hearing faint noises from outside, scraping sounds against the door frame, soft thuds on the roof, like something or someone was lingering, waiting. The next day, Jake couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. It wasn't just the delivery driver, it was something bigger, something he couldn't fully explain. He spent hours searching online, looking for clues. His fingers tapped quickly across the keyboard as he searched for terms like fake delivery scam and criminal home invasion using packages. What he found sent a chill down his spine. He stumbled across stories of home invasion rings that used fake delivery drivers to scope out homes. The idea was simple: the criminals would pose as delivery drivers to survey the house, test the waters, and check for valuables or weaknesses in security. Then they would return later, once they knew the house was vulnerable. The more Jake read, the more his skin prickled. He realized that everything about the driver, the urgency, the odd behavior, the lack of information about the package pointed to something far darker than a mere mix-up. But Jake looked out the window. His neighborhood, usually lively, seemed eerily quiet now. There were no children playing in yards, no neighbors walking dogs. It was too still. He noticed a few unfamiliar cars parked near his house, too close for comfort. The driver's behavior wasn't a mistake. It was part of a bigger plan, and Jake had unknowingly been drawn into IT. The more Jake thought about it, the more terrified he became. Had the driver been watching him? Had he been staking out the house for days, waiting for the right moment to strike? He began to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in on him. Every little noise outside made him jump, and his mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. The doorbell rang again. This time it was different. There was no politeness, no pretense of a mistake. The man who stood on the other side was not the delivery driver Jake had seen before. This man was taller, more menacing, with a look of cold determination. "I told you I'd be back," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "Now open the door. We don't have time for games." Jake's heart raced. He knew this was it, the moment he had been dreading. The man was part of the group. This wasn't about the package anymore. This was about breaking in. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to defend himself. He ran to the kitchen, grabbing the first thing he could, a heavy, blunt object. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He held it tightly in his hands, waiting for the door to break open. His pulse thudded in his ears, but instead of the door breaking down, there was the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief flooded Jake's chest. He quickly grabbed his phone and dialed the police, telling them about the suspicious activity. They had arrived in time. The delivery driver, now revealed as part of a criminal operation, was arrested at the scene, along with 2 others who had been stationed nearby. Jake's house had nearly been scouted for a robbery. The driver's insistent returns had been a tactic to see if Jake would leave the house vulnerable. As the police left with the criminals in handcuffs, Jake stood at the door, staring into the now empty street. He had been lucky, but as the sun set, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was watching him from the shadows. His home, once a place of comfort, no longer felt safe. The fear lingered, and the doorbell would never sound the same again. It was one of those rare, quiet evenings where the world outside seemed to fade away. Emma sat on her couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a steaming cup of tea in her hand. The soft hum of the TV was the only sound in the room, a gentle background to the flickering of the fireplace. She'd just moved into the house a few weeks ago, and everything was still new: bright walls, crisp sheets, fresh paint. It was supposed to be her sanctuary. But tonight, something felt different. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her thoughts. The screen lit up with a notification. Alarm deactivated. Emma frowned. She hadn't touched her alarm system all evening. Her fingers tapped the screen to open the security app. There it was again: the alarm had been deactivated. The red alert flashed ominously across the screen. She immediately checked her front door and windows, ensuring everything was locked and secure. Nothing seemed out of place. Glit, she muttered to herself, shaking her head and resetting the system. She let out a sigh of relief, thinking it was probably some technical issue. Maybe a bug in the app. It wasn't the first time she'd had a problem with technology, after all. The house was full of smart devices, and sometimes they malfunctioned. Settling back into her spot, Emma tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up her spine, but the quiet around her had become too heavy. She glanced toward the window and caught a flicker of movement, just a shadow. Was it a tree branch in the wind, or something else? She quickly pushed the thought aside. It was just her imagination, but then her phone buzzed again. Another notification: alarm deactivated. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the app. She hadn't touched the alarm again. There was no reason for it to be deactivated. Her skin prickled. This wasn't a glitch, it couldn't be. She stood, her body stiffening with a growing unease, and walked to the door to check the locks again. She heard a faint noise, like something scraping against the ground outside. Was someone there? No. It was just the wind, wasn't it? Maybe I'm just tired, she thought, trying to calm herself. She reset the system once more, this time staying in the hallway to watch the door, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. It's just paranoia, she told herself. But deep down, Emma knew something wasn't right. The night dragged on, and with every passing hour, the notifications kept coming. Alarm deactivated again, and again. Emma was no longer dismissing it as a glitch. She had reset the alarm 3 times now, each time with more urgency, more confusion. Each time the phone buzzed, the sense of dread deepened. It felt like someone was playing a game with her. But why? And how? The idea of someone sneaking around, manipulating the alarm system from the outside, seemed absurd at first. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Was someone trying to get inside? Was the house being targeted? Her breath quickened. She stepped toward the window, peeking out through the blinds. The street outside was dark, with only the soft glow of the street lamp illuminating the sidewalks. But there, just at the edge of her view, she thought she saw something move, a dark shape darting behind the neighbor's fence. Her pulse quickened. It's just the trees, she muttered, though even she didn't believe it. The wind wasn't blowing that hard. The phone buzzed again. Alarm deactivated. Emma was no longer sure if she was imagining it, but the sound of something scraping against the side of the house, faint but distinct, made her blood run cold. She quickly grabbed the phone and checked the security camera feed, but there was nothing, no one. It could have been the wind again, or so she hoped. She had to get to the bottom of this. She called customer support, explaining the situation, asking if there were any signs of an issue with the system. The representative on the other end reassured her that the system was functioning properly. Perhaps it's a software glitch, they suggested. Emma didn't buy it. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. She stared at the app on her phone. The notifications just kept coming. Alarm deactivated, but this time there was something different. She noticed a pattern. The alerts were always at specific intervals. Someone was watching, waiting for her to become complacent, Outside, she heard something again. This time it was closer, a scraping sound, followed by what could have been a footstep. She backed away from the window, heart hammering in her chest. Was someone out there? A knock at the door made her jump. She froze, eyes wide, listening. But there was nothing, no voice, no follow-up sound. Her heart beat so loudly she could barely hear the faintest noise coming from the street. But she had no idea how close the danger was. The night felt endless. Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her phone resting on the nightstand. Alarm deactivated, another notification. She hadn't reset it this time. She was exhausted, drained by the constant tension and the nagging suspicion that something was terribly wrong. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized something far worse. She wasn't dealing with a random glitch. Someone was deliberately hacking into her system. Her heart pounded as the realization sank in. Her alarm system wasn't malfunctioning, it was being bypassed remotely. She immediately opened her security app again, but this time she scrolled through the settings with purpose. And there it was, an IP address linked to the deactivations. A remote source. Someone outside was hacking into her system. Her stomach twisted as she realized that this person, this hacker, was watching her. They were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She tried to lock the system down, but the app refused to cooperate. It was locked out. She couldn't control her own security anymore. She felt a wave of helplessness flood over her. Her phone buzzed again. Alarm deactivated. She could do nothing but stare at the screen, paralyzed by the horror of knowing that someone out there was playing with her life. A faint sound outside the window made her freeze. This time she wasn't imagining it. The sound was distinct footsteps. Emma grabbed her phone and checked the security cameras again. Her breath caught. There, just outside the frame, she saw a figure, brief but unmistakable. It was too quick to see clearly, but she knew someone was there. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase, and moved cautiously toward the door. The sound outside had grown louder, more distinct. The scraping, the footsteps, the unmistakable presence of someone lurking just beyond the windows. Emma knew she had no choice now. The door handle rattled. Her heart raced. The figure outside wasn't waiting anymore. They were coming in. She moved quickly to the door, her breath shaky, trying to steady her trembling hands. But before she could reach it, the door creaked open just a crack. The intruder had already gained entry. "Who's there?" Emma's voice was shaky, but she demanded an answer. No response, only the steady sound of breathing. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall and cloaked in black. The figure was too tall to be anyone she knew, and the hollowed-out feeling of fear intensified as it stepped closer. "What do you want?" Emma demanded, trying to summon courage she wasn't sure she had. The figure said nothing, but as it moved closer, Emma saw something shocking. This wasn't just a random intruder. The figure raised a phone to show her, spur a screen. It was her security system, the one she thought she had locked out. They were controlling it remotely, controlling her life. "You've been watching me," Emma whispered, the realization crashing into her. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the intruder turned and fled into the night, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived minutes later, but by then the intruder was gone. Emma was left standing in the quiet, her heart pounding, knowing that the hacker had only just begun. Her security was useless now, and the fear that gripped her was deeper than ever before. It was 11:30 p.m., and the house was eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint tick of a clock on the wall, and the distant rustling of tree branches outside. The kind of quiet that only came when everyone else was asleep and the world outside seemed to fade into an unnatural stillness. Alex, a 17-year-old high school student, was home alone. Their parents had left for the weekend, visiting some relatives a few hours away, leaving Alex with the house to themselves. At first, it was exhilarating, the freedom to stay up late, watch whatever movies they wanted, eat whatever they wanted, but as the night wore on, that familiar feeling of isolation began to creep in. The house was bigger than they liked, and the long hallway leading to their room felt like it stretched for miles when the lights were off. At times, it almost felt like the house was alive, the floorboards groaning and creaking under the weight of something. But Alex pushed those thoughts aside. They were just being paranoid. Lying in bed, scrolling through their phone, they tried to distract themselves from the silence. Maybe some music would help. Alex reached for the Bluetooth speaker on the nightstand and clicked it on. As the soft notes of their favorite playlist filled the room, a sudden, sharp knock echoed through the house. Startled, Alex froze. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that it sent a chill down their spine. They glanced at the clock, 11:40 p.m. Who could it be this late? Maybe it was just a neighbor, perhaps someone had the wrong house or needed to borrow something. But then there was another knock. This one was louder, more insistent. Thump, thump, thump. Alex's heart rate picked up. It was too late for a casual visitor. No one would be out this time of night unless there was an emergency or worse, someone with bad intentions. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, and Alex found themselves holding their breath as they listened to the rhythm. There was something unsettling about the way it persisted, as if the person on the other side of the door knew Alex was inside. Alex slowly slid off the bed, their feet touching the cold wooden floor. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of their phone screen. They glanced nervously toward the door, then back at the window. No one was in the yard, or at least no one they could see. Still, a deep sense of unease settled in their gut. Was this a prank? Taking a deep breath, Alex moved toward the door, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their feet betraying their presence. They reached the peephole and cautiously peered through it. On the other side, standing in the dim light, was a man. His back was turned to the door, and he was muttering to himself, almost in a low chant. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, and he looked disheveled. Alex couldn't make out his face, but there was something about his posture, the way he seemed disconnected from the world around him, that made a cold shiver run up Alex's spine. This wasn't a neighbor or someone they knew. This man seemed out of place, unsettling. Alex's pulse quickened. The knocking came again, louder this time. The man wasn't leaving, he just kept knocking, as if waiting for something, waiting for Alex to answer. Alex's stomach twisted into a knot. The man wasn't just knocking, he was demanding something. His muttering grew louder, though Alex still couldn't understand what he was saying. It didn't make any sense. A small voice in Alex's head told them to call the police, to get help. But another voice, one that sounded too calm, suggested that maybe they were overreacting. Maybe the man was lost. Maybe he needed help. The voice that was urging Alex to open the door and just talk to him fought with the one that screamed to stay safe. The knocking continued, persistent and maddening. Alex backed away from the door, pressing their back against the wall. The knocking seemed to reverberate throughout the house, growing louder with each second. They felt like they were being suffocated by the sound. The decision to call their parents was tempting, but their phone was on the bed, and they didn't want to leave the door unguarded. Besides, what could they even say? Someone's knocking on my door, and it's freaking me out. It didn't sound like an emergency, but what if it was? Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt deafening. The house was too still, too quiet, and the thought of the man still standing on the other side of the door made Alex's pulse race. They had no idea what he wanted, but they knew one thing: it wasn't a normal visit. Taking another step away from the door, Alex tried to think rationally. They needed to do something. They grabbed their phone and quickly texted their best friend, Lucy, telling her that someone was at the door and asking if she could talk for a minute to calm Alex down. They didn't want to freak out their parents, who were already hours away. The response came almost instantly: call the cops. This isn't normal. Alex stared at the text for a moment, hesitating. Lucy was right. It wasn't normal. But was it really that bad? Maybe they could just get rid of the guy by telling him they weren't interested. But then Alex's mind raced. What if it was someone dangerous? What if it wasn't just a guy asking for directions? They needed to act now. The man could be sizing up the house, looking for an entry point. If Alex didn't do something, the situation could escalate quickly. They stepped back to the window, slowly pulling the blinds apart just enough to see outside. The man was still standing there, his back to the door. But now he had stopped muttering. He was looking up at the house, his head tilted back, as though studying it. The air felt heavier, and Alex's skin crawled as the realization hit them the man wasn't lost. And he wasn't here by accident. He was watching, waiting. Suddenly the man turned around, his face now visible in the dim light from the porch lamp. He was older than Alex expected, maybe in his mid-40s, with graying hair and a scruffy beard. His face was covered in a layer of dirt and grime, and his eyes were bloodshot, wild. Alex felt their breath catch in their throat as the man's gaze locked onto the window. His lips curled into a twisted smile, and for a split second, Alex could have sworn he winked. The man then took a few steps forward, closer to the door, and pounded harder, more furiously than before. Thud. Thud. The force behind the knocks made the door shake, as if it might give way under the pressure. Alex stepped back, heart racing, and grabbed their phone. This time they didn't hesitate, they dialed 911. Their hands trembled as they pressed the call button. The dispatcher answered almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone at my door, Alex stammered, trying to steady their breath. He won't stop knocking. I don't know who he is, but he's not leaving, and I think he's dangerous. Please, I'm home alone. The dispatcher's voice was calm and reassuring. Stay inside, lock all doors and windows. I'm sending officers to your location right now. Can you see the person? Do you have a description? Alex hurriedly gave the dispatcher a description of the man, but as they spoke, the knocking grew louder again, more frantic. Alex glanced toward the door, feeling a cold sweat break out across their skin. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone, steady. Officers are 5 minutes away. Stay hidden and don't engage, but Alex wasn't sure if they could wait that long. The man was getting more erratic, more insistent. And as the knocking continued, Alex felt trapped, like the walls of the house were closing in on them. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The knocking stopped once again, leaving an almost deafening silence in its wake. Alex couldn't bring themselves to move. They stayed on the phone with 911, their eyes locked on the door, willing it to remain quiet. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Suddenly there was a sound, a scraping, like fingernails on the glass of the window. Alex's heart leaped in their chest, and they quickly looked toward the window. The man had moved around the side of the house and was now attempting to peer through the windows, his face twisted in madness. It was then that a thought struck Alex like a bolt of lightning. They remembered hearing about an escaped convict on the news the week before. A dangerous man who had been on the run for days after breaking out of prison. The details had been scattered, but the reports mentioned that he was targeting people who were home alone. His method was simple: knock on the door, acting lost or confused, and if the person let him in, he would overpower them. If not, he would move on to the next house. The description of the convict from the news report matched the man standing outside. Everything clicked into place. This wasn't just some random visitor. This was the escaped convict, and Alex had become his target. The weight of that realization hit Alex hard, sending a wave of panic rushing through their body. What should they do now? They couldn't outrun him, and he had already shown he wasn't going anywhere. Alex's grip on their phone tightened, and they quickly relayed this new information to the 911 dispatcher, who promised that officers were on the way, and that they had already alerted nearby units to the presence of the convict. As the minutes ticked by, Alex continued to hide, every creak of the floorboards sending waves of terror through their body. The man outside had stopped scraping at the window. The silence now felt like a ticking time bomb. And then there was a sudden knock on the door. But this time it wasn't frantic, it was calm, almost deliberate. "I know you're in there," the man said, his voice muffled by the door but unmistakable in its chilling calm. "I just need some help." Letney and Alex's breath caught in their throat as they backed away from the door, feeling the cold terror settle deep within their bones. The man's voice was low and haunting, and Alex knew in that moment that he wasn't there to ask for help, he was there to take control. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the outside of the house, the sound of something heavy slamming against the door. Alex recoiled, hearing the metal handle rattle in its frame. The man was trying to break in. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm Alex, the sound of sirens in the distance became louder. The man outside heard them too, his expression twisting in frustration. With one last desperate attempt, he rammed his shoulder against the door, trying to break through. But before he could try again, the police arrived, their lights flashing through the windows. Officers quickly stormed the property, surrounding the house with precision. The man had no choice but to retreat, his hands raised in surrender.